Good morning and welcome to User Testing. Is your website trustworthy and easy to use? Here's what we're going to cover. So we're going to start just a little bit by talking about what user testing is and a little bit what it's not, what you want to do in advance to make sure you're prepared for success. We're going to talk about the parts of a user test. So we're going to break it down and talk about what you might say, figuring out what you learned, which, because we're talking about a really fairly basic and straightforward user test, is not going to be a big piece, but we'll talk about what you do. We're going to have two actual user tests where I'm going to be working with people who have not seen the site on questions they haven't heard before. So you'll see what this looks like with the hope that you'll say, oh, yeah, that's pretty straightforward. I can do that. And then, as I mentioned, there'll be some good amount of time at the end for Q&A. Who am I? I am Laura S. Quinn. I am a consultant that specializes in helping nonprofits build websites. So both as a coach to people as they either build their own site or work with vendors or just have ongoing processes to create content, think about ongoing update and maintenance, things like that. I also do strategy for big sites. Let us dive in. What is user testing? So it's the idea that you're going to show your website to a group of people in or akin to your target audience. So 4 to 6 people is about the right amount of people who are similar to each other. And we'll talk a little bit about why that number. To understand how they understand and would use your site. So something like, from looking at this page, what do you think this organization does? To help you understand how you could improve the site, because knowledge is power. You don't necessarily need to, if you find out you have some, really costly problem, I mean, it's good to know. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it. It doesn't mean you have to do it any more than it did before. But now you have that knowledge and can potentially work towards a roadmap. What user testing isn't? I think the biggest mistake that people make is that they think that they're asking people what they want or need or like. So it's specifically not about asking people what they think your website should do, or whether they like your logo or anything else. People are notoriously bad at knowing what they want and fickle in terms of what they like. So this stuff it's very difficult to gather. If this is what you want to know, it's a much harder research topic, and this is not the way to get it. So simply asking 4 to 6 people to look at your site and say, what do you think of our logo, is not going to get you any good responses to, in fact, what the world, how the world will respond to your logo. It's also not a good way to find out what your user base expects from you, what members want, anything like that. Or, as I mentioned, assuming that you need to make the changes that they have told you that you have identified. So you can make easy changes and leave hard changes. You are the boss of you. You can do whatever you want. All right, so that's what it is. Let's talk about how to do it. So we are talking about specifically short user tests that any staff member can do. So I am talking about not necessarily a very complicated set of research that you need to do a ton of preparation for, but instead my goal with this session is to make you feel empowered that you or one of the people who works with you can in fact go do this themselves. So that's the context in which we're talking, and that's the context in which I'm talking about preparing. So this will not prepare you for every kind of user research, but it will prepare you for the kind of user test about things like credibility, straightforward usability that we're focused on today. So you want to start by thinking about what audience or audiences you want to test. Logically, you probably have a number of audiences for your site. So could be, for instance, donors, law firms. This looks like a legal advocacy site, maybe policymakers, those that have a problem that might be legal, tenants, intake staff. These are not the same audience. And you can't go, so since we're saying we're doing a test with 4 to 6 people, those 4 to 6 people need to have at least somewhat the same perspective. So you might be able to do those who have a problem that might be legal and tenants facing eviction. You know, those could conceivably, you might have those two together in your audience. Really, all the rest of these are pretty different. So you want to think through, who can I test with, who have kind of generally the same view of the world. And you want to think about, what do you want to know? Which is these two are, they kind of, they relate to each other, obviously. So what you want to know is going to imply who you want to test with and vice versa. So more general things, can they understand your site? Would they recommend your organization? That's kind of credibility type stuff. How would they answer a key specific question based on the information on their site? Basically, can they find stuff? Given a specific scenario, what on the website could help them? How would they navigate through it? If they decided to make a donation, how would they do that? So we're focusing today on a 15-minute test, kind of 15 to 20-minute test, which is probably long enough for one general, one specific, maybe 2 more specific, but not a lot more than that. You don't want to cram too much into to a test. All right, probably one of the most challenging things, in fact, for this type of test is figuring out who you're going to do the test with. So you want to do the test ideally with people who are relatively similar to the audience. So ideally, they're people actually in the audience. So if you are going to, if you're trying to target legislative aides, that you actually go ask some people who are legislative aides if they can spare 15 minutes to do an online user test with you. We're focused, and I'm going to talk in a minute about different kinds. We're going to focus on online user tests today. So that's the ideal. And logically, you probably have an email list. Email can be a great way to find people. And we're going to talk about scheduling people in a second. So if you can, for instance, if you're looking for 4 to 6 people, you can email about 10 times that number, 40 to 60 people, to get 4 to 6 people who will say yes and will schedule themselves for a test. One thing you want to try to avoid doing is testing with super fans of your organization. So people who you know love your organization. So like, for instance, if you are testing your donation functionality, going to find people who are recurring donors to test it. Those are people who know and love your organization, may well have done it before. Like, they're not going to give you good data because most people are not super fans. For this type of test, friends and family of staff who aren't dissimilar, so are kind of, you can envision them in that role, will work, or better than nothing. As long as they're not in the technology field. You want to make sure that you don't have people who are who actually build websites or technology or do user testing, because they tend to be very bad user testers. They tend to give you lots of advice on what you should be doing differently as opposed to actually going through your test. Very frequently, people ask, all right, we're doing 4 to 6 users. Is that actually enough? What's the sample? That sample size seems really small. So when you're talking about qualitative rather than quantitative data, sample size doesn't apply in the same way. So you're looking at the number of people who say things rather than some holistic number. So if half of the people you test with, if 2 or 3 of 6 people struggle with the same thing, then you can be sure that a notable number of your visitors struggle with it as well. It's not necessarily, it's not representing. If 2 of your 6 users struggle with it, it's not necessarily representing that 1/3 of all your users are having that problem, but it's a problem that you should do something about. This is from the very kind of the king of user testing, Jacob Nielsen and the Norman group, talking about the return on the number of testers. So here you can find the usability problems found and the number of testers. And you can actually see that they found that they did a big test to get this. One finds the most of the problems at only 3, 4, 6. You're approaching almost all your problems being found. In fact, at only 2 or 3, you're finding a lot. The problem at 2 or 3, I find, is that you also find weird testers who find weird things. So it's if you only test with 2 users, it's pretty hard to tell whether you've got an outlier or whether you've got like if one person says something, are 50% of your people going to struggle with it, or do you have one person who just has strange opinions? So 4 is a good compromise there. 6 feels very solid. People will start saying the same things. 6 also gives you room for people to cancel, which is something we're going to talk about in a minute. All right, online, live, or automated. So 3 key ways that you can do a user test. Live online is what we're doing today. They're straightforward to conduct, to schedule, which is a very important thing, to get people to actually show up and to record. They tend to be my default unless I have a reason to do a different type. So I tend to do online live tests and not rely on automated online tests unless data quantity is really critical for stakeholders. Like, no one's going to believe me unless I have 40 people, which is just wrong-headed in my mind, but that doesn't always, sway stakeholders. You have time to do more setup and analysis so that it's not as much of a kind of guerrilla test. Or you're doing something other than the task-based testing that we're doing. So there are definitely things like tree tests or other kinds of tests, which definitely do make sense as automated tests. Some kind of content analysis to see whether people understand and can, answer questions about it. That might make sense. Live in-person testing can be compelling in a couple cases. And in fact, I know we've got a lot of legal aid people on the line today. That may be, so if you have potential testers on site, like you're a YMCA or say a courthouse, I've got a couple courthouses here today, and or you think your audience might have trouble with an online conferencing tool. So there is often some issues just kind of getting up and running with an online conferencing tool. if you think that that your testers might have problems and might have never used an online conferencing, for instance, or might have never used a desktop or a mouse. Some people have used mobile almost exclusively. And testing on testing on a literal phone is a top priority. You can do testing on a kind of a makeshift phone remotely, but testing on a literal phone with literal things like are they clicking, and is the click big enough, and things like that, which does become important for mobile first things. So if you're a legal aid organization who is working with low-income people who may be less tech savvy, and you have the advantage of partners at places like libraries or courthouses, live in-person testing might actually make sense for you. And if people want to hear more about that, I'll talk a little more about kind of some of the differences at the end. Did not expect to get quite the concentration of legal aid that I got. So great. Perfect. Scheduling online tests. So you're sending this what did we say, 10 times, so 40, actually you probably want a little more, so there's room to cancel. So let's say 80 emails out to say, something like, would you help X organization with 15 minutes of your time? Very general email. This is very generally what we're doing. If you're willing, will you go to this link, something like Calendly, to schedule yourself? If your test is less than 15 minutes or so, 25 minutes or so, usually, unless you have low income users, you usually don't need an incentive. For an online test, there's not a lot of that is not a lot of commitment from most people's perspective. If you expect it to be a commitment or something that they're going to have trouble making time for, then you should think about what you can give them that would thank them for their time, because obviously time is valuable. You want to expect several to reschedule, which is why using something like Calendly is really useful. It'll allow them to reschedule themselves, and expect 1 or 2 to cancel altogether. So you want to schedule some backups. And you want to, in advance, create an interview guide. So basically a document that reminds you how you want to ask questions, not really verbatim to ask verbatim, but to guide you. It's a guide. And it's often handy to leave space to leave notes. So to either print it out and write them on, or to take them online. All right. Questions about any of that before? I'm going to just kind of quickly walk through the parts of a user test before I show them in action. Yeah, Miri asks, is it possible to do online mobile testing? Yes, you would do it using a mobile emulator. So you could, in fact, maybe I will ask Marianne, who's our first tester, to just shrink up her screen to show the approximately what it might look like on mobile and to test it that way. There's other ways to do it as well that probably involve me having something on my screen and asking them to tell me what they would click. Just because otherwise getting the emulator going is going to be a little tricky. But yes, absolutely. The simply shrinking your browser so it's narrow does most of what a mobile would do. Fabulous. All right, opening of a user test. Obviously you want to thank them. You want to introduce yourself. You want to provide a very vague connection between you and the organization and what you're doing. You don't want to imply that you have created what they are looking at today, even though, even if you have. So I like something like, I'm helping blah organization take a look at their website, which is equally true whether I have zero connection with it or I have, which I do occasionally do. I user tests like comparative websites, or I've like literally built the thing by hand. You want to be vague about what you're doing. It's you care a lot more about what you're doing than they do. Don't say testing. Testing sounds scary, and no matter what you say, it'll sound like you're testing them. Be human. Make sure you don't sound like a robot. So do a little chit chat. You know, how's your morning going? See if you can engage them a little bit in saying something before you dive in. Some people won't engage, and yeah, don't force someone who hates chit chat to do it. You want to introduce what it is you're doing, the concept. So I'm going to ask you to look around a website while sharing your screen, answer some questions. It's not a test of your skill, just hoping to see how real people use the site. Check to see if they have questions. But if you're doing something interesting and they have actual questions, you probably don't want to answer them now, so mostly save them until the end. Remember not to say test of, you're not doing user testing. I actually have used a test to say it's not a test. Don't forget to turn on the recording, which I always put on in the script that question to ask about it. Number one, so I don't forget, but also you should absolutely ask permission. And don't do it if they don't want you to. Screen share. This is actually probably not the trickiest place, but it can get the most kind of nerve-wracking to achieve their screen share. So basically, you're going to walk them through. I'm going to ask you to open a site on your computer and share your screen. I'm going to ask you how to do that. Here's the link in the chat. So I'm going to go through, we're going to actually do this twice, so you'll see it happen. Here's a link in the chat. Can you see? Do you see it? Can you open it? Great. Now can you share your screen? Be prepared to troubleshoot. So know your tool. Be patient and friendly. So don't get irritated at them if it feels like they are not doing what you say. In the worst case, you can share your own screen. So you can open up the website on your own screen and tell them to control the mouse. Great. Where should I go now? What should I click on? Where would you go on this screen? Definitely not as good, but completely doable in a pinch. And in fact, as I just mentioned to Mary, if you want to do kind of mobile testing without a mobile phone, that is an option with a mobile emulator. Start with the task that's easiest. Give them the task and ask them to talk through their thoughts a bit. So one of the challenges of the task is to kind of get them talking. Some people may or may not actually say much, like they just want to get in and do things, and so you might need to prompt them. You must then be silent. This is by far and away my biggest advice for people getting started with user testing. You must stop talking and let them do things. You let uncomfortable silence fall until they say something, or until it's like literally 10 seconds. And then you can potentially prompt. And I have some prompts on the next page. But if it's not uncomfortable some of the time, you are probably doing it wrong. So yes, you're there to watch and listen. You are absolutely not there to explain or to help or to tell, especially to tell them why it's that way and excuse the site. Like all of that is the way to just immediately shut down any input that they might have. So here are some prompts. So if you're feeling, many people won't need prompts, things will just happen and it will be lovely. Some people won't talk and it's hard to tell what they're thinking. So some prompts can help there. What are you thinking as you look at this page? Can you tell me a little about what you were looking for when you clicked on that link? Great question. Let me answer that at the end. So you're not answering any questions, or what would you do if I weren't here? So basically nearly any question, like, can I click on this button? Nearly every question is answered with, what would you do if I weren't here? And logically, most people, if you say that 2 or 3 times, they're gonna get the idea. They're getting the idea that you're not answering their questions. They may get waylaid. Some people have a tendency to give lots of feedback about lots of things. I don't like this logo. This page is too long. Why are these pictures here? So thank them for all of that input. All input is, at least to their mind, good input. You will mostly ignore this stuff. This is not useful to you. But obviously you're not going to tell them it's not useful. You thank them and you try to prompt them back to their task. So, I don't like this logo. This page is too long. Thank you for that. That's really useful. Looking around, what would you say that the org does on a day-to-day basis? Are you back to what they were supposed to be doing in the first place? Remember that you're there to learn. It's not time for you to educate or to coach. If you feel you must, then that comes at the end. I'd say that's questionable even at the end. If they're notably frustrated, so you can see them being frustrated and it's like 10 seconds, like they're frustrated for a long time and it's super uncomfortable, you can give them a hint. Like, what would you think would happen if you clicked on X? But that should not be the first place you go. That should be really a last resort. Repeat for your tasks and then close. So you basically, this is just timing wise. So about 5 minutes for intros and getting online, stuff like that. 5 minutes for a typical task. If you told them it would be a 15-minute task, or whatever, 20-minute task, don't go longer without asking permission. Generally you can. There's very few people who have carefully scheduled in 15 minutes, but definitely ask permission. Thank them. Answer any questions they had that you'd really like to answer. You can try to ignore questions that you really don't want to answer, but wrap up with something like, any other questions or thoughts before we wind up? So if they felt strongly that they wanted to ask it, they can ask it again. All right. Any other questions or thoughts before we do some actual user testing? Elena asks, the last resort question for when someone is very frustrated. So someone is very frustrated. You want to give them a hint. So something that's not like, okay, click on this, but something like, what do you think would happen if you clicked on X? Or what would be another example? Perhaps in the upper left-hand side of your screen. To try to guide them toward something that would help them without really overtly giving it away.